Hi, this is Justin Colletti of SonicScoop, and welcome to this week's episode of the SonicScoop podcast. Today, we are talking about a legend, Bob Power. He passed away earlier this week, but in case you're not familiar with him, Bob is an amazing, or was an amazing, mixing engineer and producer who really helped change the sound and the face of hip hop. He made, I gotta say, some of my favorite hip hop records of all time. He was really prolific, especially in the early and mid and late 90s, with artists like De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, Erykah Badu, D'Angelo, I'm going to mispronounce this one, but Michelle Ndegocello. How do you say her name? The bass player. She's so good, but I can never say her name correctly. But he has had an influence in the way that people produce music to this day. And we're going to explore some of his music, some of his mixes, and some of his sounds together. I've actually got a Spotify playlist here if you guys want to play along with me, because on this playlist, I've done this with a lot of other mixers in the Mixing Great series, where I create a playlist for you guys. I'll put it in the show notes in the description later, where you can check out his mixes next to mixes from other mixing engineers on the same album, with the same producers on them, going through the same mastering, so we can get a sense of just how Bob approached music production, how he liked to hear things, and what was unique and distinctive about his style. So on this playlist that I'll share with you guys, all the odd numbered tracks are going to be a track that Bob mixed, and all the even ones will be tracks that someone else mixed on the same record. And they'll give you some insight into just exactly what made him tick, what made him different, and what made him special. Bob is a guy that I knew personally. I first met Bob, I want to say, my goodness, what year? In 2011? Before I was the SonicScoop podcast, I actually produced an early version of the SonicScoop podcast called the Input Output podcast. And Bob was a guest on there. And I first met him when I was producing that podcast. And I've met him a number of times since then. And Bob, to this day, actually has the most popular video on this YouTube channel. If we look up Bob Power's masterclass, his biggest masterclass here, this mixing masterclass with Bob Power, oh my goodness. This has how many? 1.5 million views on it. We did back in 2017. If you haven't checked this out, you absolutely should. This one we did live at the Manhattan Center in Brooklyn in Manhattan. My goodness. I was living in Brooklyn at the time, and we also did mixed kind of events in Brooklyn, but the Manhattan Center in Manhattan of all places. And he gave us a presentation on stage that for the first 30 minutes, he doesn't play a single sound. He just talks about his philosophy of mixing. And it's so engaging, and there's so much wisdom in it that it's gone on to be the most popular video on this channel. Because the other thing about Bob is, in addition to being a great producer, engineer, mixer, and honestly a great guy, is he was a great mentor to many people. He taught at the NYU Clive Davis Institute and kind of helped a whole new generation of producers and engineers and artists there. But he was also a mentor to people in the studio. If you hear the way that guys like the guys in Tribe Called Quest talk about him, the way Michelle talks about him, they really talk about him as a person who is extremely open and answering questions constantly. Q-Tip was a producer and a mixer in his own right, and he was always asking Bob questions like, what does this knob do? What does this one do? And people talk about Bob having a lot of patience for that kind of thing and really wanting to take people under his wing and help them get better results in the studio. And that's honestly part of what made Bob's career take off. Soon we'll listen to some of his stuff together, but part of what happened with Bob is that he was a, classically trained jazz musician, I guess you'd say, where he was like a real player. He played in R&B groups, and he wrote jingles for, major companies like BMW and I think Coca-Cola. And he wrote a whole bunch of jingles for a whole bunch of different people. And he came into the studio and was invited to engineer for some of these hip hop sessions. And he'd been around that culture a bit in a way that some of the guys from the old boys club of making pop and rock records in New York, weren't open to working with this totally different demographic on this totally different style of music. And Bob was. And he was about finding out, like, what's your music supposed to sound like? Because honestly, when you listen to the sounds that Bob made with a band like Tribe Called Quest, which we'll listen to soon, and some of the sounds he got with someone like Erykah Badu, this is not what records sounded like before Bob Power was working on records with these artists. They were absolutely going a different way with the sonic palette. And when we compare Bob's mixes to some other mixes, even on the same record, we'll hear just how willing he was to do things kind of wrong, to kind of push some of these muddier, murkier, beefier frequencies that people weren't amping up in an effort to make things sound squeaky and clean. And Bob will be the first to admit that he came from a background of, he'd be the kind of guy where Steely Dan would be the reference, right? Super clean Swiss watch of a music. And he was big on asking people, well, what should your record sound like? Like, how do you want it to sound different compared to the whole library of recorded music out there? Which direction do you want to push in? And rather than resisting people and saying, no, you can't do it that way. That's the wrong way to do it. That's not how we do it. Rather than stamping his vision on things, it was really trying to get into a groove with the artist and figure out, how do they want these records to sound? And that's part of why those records sounded way different. And I gotta say, the era of music production that Bob did in the early 90s, mid 90s, through the late 90s when he was the most active, hip hop records don't sound like that anymore today. And we're gonna talk a little bit about why. I'd also love to hear your comments if you have any questions or if you have any stories of your own from meeting Bob Power or even listening to his records. Feel free to type them in the chat. In the second half of this episode, I'll be reading your chats aloud. So that's kind of enough of my preamble. Like, on a personal level, I probably only met Bob half a dozen times or so. I'd like to call him a friend because he was so friendly. And like, if I wrote him an email or called him, he would answer. And I thought that was really cool. But, I wasn't super chummy with him. So I can't say anything about him other than he was the kind of guy where you meet him and you feel instantly at ease. Like, he just instantly established rapport with people. He had a certain confidence about himself. And I find this in so many great producers and mixers who find good careers for themselves, is that he was just very approachable, very confident, very comfortable in his own skin, but also very open and interested in other people. There were also things like I disagreed with him about. Like, he was big on saying, like, the preamp is really, really important. And I kind of disagree. I like preamps and I like to nerd out about them, but I don't think they're like super duper important. And we totally had like very civil disagreements about this, where he's like really interested in like, well, why would you say that? Why do you have a different perspective on this than I do? And I don't know. He was just a really cool guy and an instant mentor and was as good of a communicator as he was at doing this stuff. And that's part of the reason that his masterclass is not only the most popular masterclass on our channel, but possibly like the most popular full-length mixing masterclass ever in the history of like masterclasses. Are there any that have more views than his? I don't know. We're talking about a video that is, what is this, an hour and 20 minutes long of a guy talking about mixing and then showing us some sounds near the end. And it's remarkable. All right, with all that out of the way, let's kind of take a tour of some of the music that Bob worked on in his career. One of the records that's really useful here is Erykah Badu's Baduism, because he mixed some of the tracks on this record, not all of them. He mixed one of the big hits, On and On, but he did not mix the big hit, Next Lifetime. Both of those are great tracks. I got to tell you, when this came out, what year is Baduism? It's 1997. I mean, when this came out, I was totally like a rock and grunge and metal and punk kind of guy. But I absolutely loved this record when it came out. It was one of my guilty pleasures. When On and On first came out as a single, I was like, I know this isn't the music I'm supposed to like, but this is so cool. And it sounds so different. It doesn't sound like these other sparkly, clean R&B records. It is like gritty and earthy and organic and human. And that's the kind of thing we hear in so much of Bob's work. So this is him at the height of his powers. I mean, 97 is when he was working on some of his biggest stuff and really had established his credibility early on with artists like Tribe Called Quest and De La Soul. And he's getting to this period where he's getting really good at production, but he's also still willing to make things sound like wrong and different from the perspective of how other R&B records were made up until this point. So let's hear a little bit of On and On, which is one of the tracks he mixed on this record. And then we'll hear a little bit of Next Lifetime, which he didn't mix, to listen for some differences there. Here's the beginning of On and On. Listen to it critically with me and let me know what stands out to you in this arrangement and this mix. Wonderful. She's an amazing performer too. But one of the things that leaps out at me is just the way that Bob heard and did low end differently from other people. Even on the same record, we'll hear a little bit of Next Lifetime in a second. Try to remember how the kick and bass on this feel, because they're like a little bit more bulbous and a little bit more round and in a way murky than the average of what kick and bass sound like on most records. And in this track, they kind of move together as a unit. One of the other big things I hear is his use of reverb. Relative to the way hip-hop and R&B records are made today, he'd have these reverbs that kind of like hang a little bit longer than you'd expect. Like Bob would use a plate reverb on hip-hop records in a way that you don't hear on most hip-hop records today, although there's been a little bit of a resurgence in that lately. Let's hear a little bit of Next Lifetime, which is the other huge track on this album that Bob didn't mix, and tell me if you can hear any differences between his approach and this approach.
Yeah, we've been knowing each other for a while.
Let's skip past this skit.
So being with you forever.
Right around here.
Or whatever I gotta do.
Here we go. So this record is, or this track on this record is way smoother than Bob's approach. Let me go back and forth between this section and just a little snippet of On and On and see if you can hear these differences, like the smoothness that's going on here. The snare is mixed so much more like a conventional 80s and 90s pop and R&B snare, where it's kind of wide and smooth. And then the background vocals are the things that get pretty, like they wrap out to the sides and draw your attention out to the sides. And then that snare is really smooth. And then there's like this scooped kind of glassy feeling in the mid-range. It's nice. It's pleasant, really smooth. Great track too. I didn't love it as much as On and On, but it has super smooth, more conventional feel.
Oh boy, it was a warm and sunny day. All I know is I wanted you. I really hoped you looked my way.
But if we listen to On and On, let's get into it.
I go on and on and on and on. My side keeps moving like a rolling stone. On and on and on and on. God damn it, I'ma sing my song.
You see how he's not afraid to be a little darker and a little bit murkier with things like kick and bass and vocal, and a little earthier and a little rootsier, and he's not afraid to be obnoxious with his snare drum. Like, if you really listen to it, it's a kind of annoying snare sound, but it has so much personality, so much vibe. And one of the things Bob talked a lot about in his mixing masterclass was just how much more important vibe is than getting things technically correct. And one of Bob's quotes that really stood out to me when he's talked about music production is that every record should have something on it that sounds like it shouldn't be there. Wow. What does that even mean? Just like meditate on that one for an hour. And yeah, he was one of these guys who was unafraid to make things sound wrong and crunked up in a way that would add vibe to a track.
I was born underwater with $3.06. Yeah, you may laugh, 'cause you did not do your math. Like 1, 2, 3. Damn, y'all feel that? Oh. Like 1, 2.
A lot of space in the arrangement. Our big kick is gone, but listen to it come back in. Probably right around here. No, not yet.
What a day, what a day. The man that knows
There it is.
something knows that he knows nothing at all. Does it seem colder in your summertime and hotter in your fall?
And again, just a different, subtly different vibe than this next track. Same producer, same album.
How can I want you? I can't help my feelings. Oh,
You hear how much wider and smoother and more sparkly Next Lifetime is, how much more the vocals wrap around. It's mixed more like an R&B record, where Bob's is mixed more like a hip-hop record. We can hear some similar stuff on D'Angelo, so here's a little bit of D'Angelo's Brown Sugar. Hear if you can pick up on any of the same kind of things I'm picking up on Bob's work. Do you hear how huge that pre-delay is on that reverb? Like before that reverb hits on the snare drum? Like we have snare and then it's like, oh, no reverb. Oh, there's the reverb. And he's willing for this snare drum to sound kind of annoying, like in a way, like it really pops out at you, like it grabs you. And I don't mean annoying in a negative way. I mean, that's how a more conventional engineer would think about this track and say, oh, there's this mid-range nasal thing happening in the snare. We've got to carve that out to make it prettier. And Bob's like, nah, that's where the personality is on this.
Let me tell you about this girl, maybe I should. I met her in Philly, and her name was Brown Sugar. See, we be making love constantly. That's why my eyes are a shade blood burgundy. The way that we kiss is unlike any other way that I be.
And isn't this different to how contemporary rap records are mixed? Where here, the 2 and 4 is really being accentuated, and that snare drum is super hot. And the 1 here is a little bit downplayed, at least on this track and this arrangement. And the vocal is a little further back, a little darker, and a little more mellow than the snare drum, which is not something we hear on hip-hop records that come out today. Now, technically, I guess D'Angelo is a little more R&B than hip-hop. But if we go to this album, what year is this here? 95. So a little bit before Erykah Badu, but we hear the same kinds of stuff going on. Go a little further ahead.
Brown sugar, babe. I guess high off of love, don't know how to behave.
And you hear how relatively kind of like dark and mid-rangey and almost in the background some of these background vocals are, instead of big and forward and featured like they are in some R&B records. Let's listen to a little bit of Lady, one off the same album that Bob didn't mix, and hear if there are any differences there. Obviously, there's arrangement differences, but good jump ahead.
I'm trying to come with the rain, and I'm gonna make it known, 'cause I want them to know about me.
There it is. You hear that difference in the background vocal, how much more featured and wrap around the background vocals are? That's a much more common approach in R&B records today, but it's not what Bob was doing. And you also hear this bass sound, right? How much more kind of like streamlined and scooped this bass sound is, instead of the kinds of bass sounds that Bob will go for, where he allows them to be like a little congested in a way that works.
I'm gonna make it known, 'cause I want them to know about me.
Like that's super smooth, but compare that to how Bob handles this stuff in a similar section.
Oh, sugar, when you're close to me, you love me right down to my knees. And whenever you let me hit it, sweet like honey when it comes to me. skin is caramel with the cocoa eyes.
Like Bob just wants to hear murkier, tubbier, more mid-rangey, low-end elements that also go deep. And it's like he wants to hear a little bit more reverb, and that reverb should separate from the instrument. Like it feels like it lingers longer, and it feels like it's more apparent, often because he's using these long pre-delays. And then he wants these vocals to have a little less top on them and be a little bit more tucked in instead of wrapping around you. And those are some of the differences I hear. He's not trying to be the prettiest sounding mixer out there. He's trying to be super characterful. So another one here we can check out is I found Can We Kick It by Tribe Called Quest. And that is a record that Bob engineered, but he's not really credited, as far as I can tell, as a mixer on it. It seems like Q-Tip is credited with mixing on the first Tribe Called Quest record. And it's not until the second Tribe Called Quest record called The Low End Theory where they start crediting Bob as mixer. And the record sounds totally different. Can I Kick It? To me, it's a lot brighter, it's a lot tighter. And then as we get to the record that Bob did, The Low End Theory, which some people consider like the Sgt. Peppers of hip hop, you really hear things getting like murkier and deeper and tubbier in the lows with this kind of trademark crack that's happening around snares. So let's listen a little bit off their first record, which Bob did engineer, but he's not credited as a mixer. And why is that? Is it maybe because Q-Tip was driving the mix more? So let's hear Can I Kick It? Kind of mixed by Bob Power, but kind of not.
Hey yo, we was having a ball, and you know, they asked me to get on the mic, and they asked me, can I kick it? Word. Can I kick it?
It's so brilliant how this sample, and I believe this is off of a Lou Reed track. What's the name of this Lou Reed track that this sample comes from? Is it, I was going to say, is it the one about no. Someone put it here in the comments. I'm almost like 98% sure this is a Lou Reed track, but how the sample like isn't timed quite properly, right? And there's a little gap in it. One of the comments I had about Bob that was so astute is that he would try to get session musicians to play. And Ron Carter, epic, famous bass player, played bass lines for a bunch of these Tribe Called Quest records. And one of the things he said about kind of working with these musicians when he had to replace guitar parts is that you almost couldn't play along to the actual hip hop production and put a guitar part on it because it wouldn't sound wrong enough. You'd almost need to like be playing along to some other record, like some other record you'd sample from. So if they were ever to do like a sound-alike guitar part, you couldn't just play your guitar on top of the record. You'd have to like play it separately and then fly it in. So there would be something like a little bit more off-kilter than just playing straight over the record, even if you were going to loop it. And that's something that we hear in the beginning of Can I Kick It, where that bass sample, it just doesn't quite line up, and it's awesome. I love that. It's so wrong, but it's great. Very wide, very sound effecty. You hear that like super wide scratching. I think it's kind of cool, but that's not the kind of thing I'm used to hearing on a record that Bob might have actually be credited with mixing himself. We'll listen to a little bit of Low End Theory in a sec, but I think it's super cool, but it's a different vibe.
Yes, you can. Can I kick it? 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 Yes, you can. Well, I'm gone. Can I kick it?
To all the people who can quest like a tribe does. Before this, did you really know what live was? Comprehend to the track force.
Big
Why?
vocal.
'Cause getting mentions on the tip of the vibe buzz. Rock and roll to the beat of the funk fuzz. Wipe your feet really good on the rhythm rug. If you feel the urge to freak, do the jitterbug. Come and spread your arms if you really need a hug. Afrocentric living is a big shrug. A life filled with, that's what I love. A lower plateau is what we're above. If you diss us, we won't even think of.
Cool. So that is Can I Kick It? Let's hear a little bit of Check the Rhyme from the next record, Low End Theory, where Bob is credited as mixing.
Check the rhyme.
Deep.
Back in the days on the boulevard I landed, we used to kick routines and the presence was fitting. It was I, the abstract.
And me, the 5-footer. I kicks the mad style, so step off the Frankfurter.
Yo, Fife, you remember that routine? That way used to make spiffy like Mr. Clean.
Do you hear how the snare drum is louder than the vocal? And the snare drum is kind of ahead of the kick drum. This is the kind of 90s hip hop feel. I almost think like the distinction between, for me, hip hop music and rap music is whether the 1 is accented or the 2 and 4 is accented. Like here, this 90s style of hip hop mixing, Bob is pushing that snare drum so far, so loud, it's in front of the vocal, and it's kind of brighter and edgier than the vocal. And it gives the vocal this kind of laid back feel. And then the kick and bass are absolutely there, but they're so big and tubby and thick sounding. And he's not trying to get a ton of definition and like a ton of like aggressive knock out of them. It's a totally different style that like defined this era of hip hop records and makes them different from other hip hop records and makes these kinds of hip hop records sometimes the hip hop records that people who don't like hip hop like. There's a few things about artists like Erykah Badu, Tribe Called Quest, De La Soul, and so many of the others that Bob worked with that's different than other, especially hip hop. In A, they're cleaner as artists. Like, right, there's less like dirty language and less like I'm a gangsta killing. Like this is is it pre-gangsta rap, or gangsta rap is kind of happening around the same time. But it doesn't have that kind of violent edge and that kind of posturing, but also how the production goes. Like it's much more pastiche, like it's much more collage, right? There's so much more sound collage going on, and they're accenting and amping up the 2 and 4. They're putting reverb on snare drums and bringing the snare drum forward in front of the vocal. This is not how gangster rap records sound at all, and it's not how most modern hip hop records sound either.
A tidbit, a smidgen. I don't get the message, so you got to run the pigeon.
You're on point, Fife.
All the time, tip.
You're on point, Fife.
All the time, tip.
You're on point, Fife.
All the time, tip.
So then grab the microphone and let your words rip.
Now here's a funky introduction of how nice I am. Tell your mother, tell your father, send a telegram. I'm like an energizer cause you see I last long. My crew is never ever whack because we snare strong.
Tell your mother and father how nice I am. It's like a totally different genre of hip hop records. It's interesting. Ron Carter, the bass player that they got to play on this record, one of the things he said is like, if there's any language I don't like on these records, then I'm going to walk right out of the booth. He was a legendary African-American jazz bassist, and he was really looking askance at like, okay, this is one of these rap records. What are these guys going to be talking about? Because I hope they're fine, young, upstanding gentlemen, which they turn out to be, relative to some of the other excesses of hip hop. But man, just such a different style of record production. If you want to hear kind of even deeper into what made Low End Theory so different, like this murkiness, this fatness in the low end, let's check out a little bit of Bugging Out. There it is. This is like a trademark. Sampled bass that sounds kind of wrong. Like you hear that skip in the sample. So wrong, so beautiful.
gravity. Never had a cavity. Got more rhymes than the one that's got family. No need to sweat Arsenio to gain some type of fame. No shame in my game, cause I always be the same. Styles upon styles is what I have. You wanted just to fight for, but you still don't know the half. I sport New Balance sneakers to avoid a narrow path. Messing around with this against the size of the... I never...
He sports New Balance sneakers. Take it. Man, these guys are like I feel like the dads of hip hop. So Bugging Out, the difference here that we're hearing between this and the prior track too is that this is not a modern remaster. Those other two were like 25th anniversary edition remasters, where there's a whole bunch of additional compression and limiting put on them. This sounds like how this record was originally mixed and mastered. You might notice it's much quieter and level. And you can now hear like some of these weird things about Bob's mixing style even more when you don't put a ton of extra limiting on it. Listen to the separation between like the bass lives down here in Murky Land and there is nothing about the bass or kick that is interfering with the mid-range area of the snare drum. Like they just live in two totally different worlds, and there's so much of this ambience around him that you don't hear in current rap records.
Styles upon styles is what I have. You wanted just to fight for, but you still don't know the half. I sport New Balance sneakers to avoid a narrow path. Messing around with this against the size of the... I never have stuff, cause I'm not a half-stepper. Drink a lot of soda, so they call me Dr. Pepper. Refuse to compete with BS competition. Your name is Special Ed, so won't you suckle with the mission? I never walk the street thinking...
And you hear how far behind the snare drum the vocal is? You just do not hear that on contemporary rap records. Listen to a little bit of Check the Rhyme from this unmastered version, and I'll play the mastered version of it and see what changes. So here's the old school original.
The abstract.
And me the 5-footer. I kicks the mad style, so step off the Frankfurter.
Yo, Fife, you remember that routine? That way used to make spiffy like Mr. Clean?
So long, that reverb.
A smidgen. I don't get the message, so you got to run
Okay,
the pigeon.
you're on point, Fife.
All the time, Tip.
You're on point, Fife.
All the time, Tip.
You're on point.
It's like the widest thing in the record is the reverb. And it's so long, and there's so much pre-delay before it hits. A little bit more.
All the time, Tip.
But then grab the microphone and let your words rip.
Now here's a phone.
But if we compare that to the modern version, this is still his mix, but remastered for a new generation.
And let your words rip.
Now here's a funky introduction of how nice I am. Tell your mother, tell your father, send a telegram. I'm like an energizer cause you see
Way louder, right?
My crew is never ever whack because we stand strong. Now if you say my style is whack, that's where you're dead wrong. I slay that body and El Segundo, then push it along. You be a fool to reply the fife is not the man.
But some of this modern mastering is also reeling in some of the quirkier things about Bob's mixing style. It's evening things out a little bit. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some multi-band processing in there, and if just some of the limiting is kind of squeezing things more into the same place together, instead of all this like space and distance and like laid back feel we had in the original mix and master, which would have been from Bob's era. All right, there's so much more we could listen to. There's, you're gonna have to help me with her name. Michelle Ndegocello. Did I get it right? Michelle Ndegocello? Michelle Ndegocello. I think I got it. These are records that sound totally different from the ones we've been listening to. And just to show some of the range in his style, this one is 96, and this other record is 93. And let's just hear a little snippet of these. Here's some of Michelle Ndegocello, mixed by Bob Bauer. In 97, around the same time as On and On.
Amazing pace, just try to stare me down.
And now you can tell we're in a totally different era of music production. This is the late 90s, and it's starting to cross the bridge into what records are going to start sounding like in the early 2000s. Much more scooped, much more bright on top. A little bit less of that murky mid-range is allowed.
When I looked at you, you looked at the ground.
And let's compare that to another track mixed by someone else on the same record.
Jesus killed the blind man so that he could see the evils of the world. Perchance blind,
Much tighter,
a
right?
dark thought overcome by the light. Maybe Judas was the better man.
And Mary made a virgin just to save face. I too am so ashamed on my bending knees, praying to my pretty white Jesus. They say you're the way, the light is so blinding.
Not mixed by Bob. Doesn't sound like it. Let's go back to Bob's.
And tells me he's not someone just passing by. And when you cleared your throat, was that your cue?
He's correctly identified here that the hi-hat is like a little bit more important to the groove than the snare. And this is the loudest vocal mixing we've heard out of Bob so far for different artists who want to hear her record in a totally different way. All right, let's go back in time to Michelle Ndegocello. I think I've got it right. From, I think, 1993, so an earlier record, one that Bob mixed. Ooh, that, like, deep resonance in the lows.
Sit back, relax, and listen to the 8-track. I dig it like an old soul record.
Yes, I'm digging you. I dig it like an old soul record, baby.
Just sit back, relax.
It's a good name for a track. I'm digging you like an old soul record. And so is the name of this next track. If that's your boyfriend, he wasn't last night. Man, what an audacious name for a track. Let's hear a little bit of this one. Not credited mixing Bob.
He said I could call him up anytime. You could call me wrong, say that I ain't right. But if that's your boyfriend, he wasn't last night. I'm the kind of woman I'll do almost anything to get what I want. I might play any little game. Call me what you like, but you know it's true. You're just jealous, cause he wasn't with you. Don't mean no harm. I just like what I see and it ain't.
Just a little thinner, tighter, and drier than Bob. There's so much more that we could listen to. With De La Soul, I haven't put De La Soul on here. I'm a big De La Soul fan. But the problem with De La Soul is on the records that he worked on, particularly De La Soul is Dead, there are so many mixers credited on De La Soul is Dead that I don't really know who mixed what. So he's credited as an engineer on this, but I just couldn't put it on here because I could not decide like which ones of these are Bob mixes and which ones aren't. So go listen to some De La Soul on your own time, because they're just awesome. Like De La Soul is one of the best rap groups in the history of the world. Listen to them. That to me does not sound like a Bob Power mix, right? But this is on a record where he's credited as one of the mixers.
What's the bottom plan? Yo, man, I gotta step out time. You wanna call me up? Take my number down. It's 2222222. I got an answer machine that can talk to you.
My guess is that this one probably wasn't mixed by Bob. But I don't know.
Hey, how you doing? Sorry I can't get through, but leave your name.
It's just like wider than I'm used to hearing from Bob, and the bass and kick profile doesn't sound like distinctively Bob to me. So if anyone has information on which tracks specifically were mixed by Bob Power from De La Soul, I'd be really curious to find out more about that. All right, let me go back over to my main screen here, and there we go. I'm going to check out your comments and see what you guys have been writing in here, if you guys have anything to say about Bob. R.I.P. to the Shakespeare of Sound, says DL1. A lot of people in here showing their love. May he rest in peace. And so many here are just paying their respects. DL1 says that rim shot sticks out in a beautiful way. Absolutely. We're probably talking about one of those, if it could have been any of the tracks, because he has a lot of snare drums and rim shots that stand out. Her vocal, talking about Erykah Badu, is clear but warm. Yeah, that's the thing. Like, Bob would not boost, usually, a lot of top end on vocals to make them feel and sound really apparent. He would keep them a little fuller, a little deeper than the average of other mixers in his style, and he'd often set them a little bit further back, with one exception being being Michelle Ndegocello, where he was able to push her vocal much further forward in level. But that one was really different from the others. DO1 says, The upright bass player sounds super smooth. I feel like Bob's has a whole extra octave of low end. Yeah, that's one of the differences, I think, with Bob compared to others, is he's okay with having a low end that's almost more felt than heard. Like he's not trying to have it stand out in your ear with a lot of upper mid-range. DL1 says, listen to the synths on the song Natural Born Killers by Dre and Ice Cube. The synths on that core sound amazing. I still don't know how he made synths resonate like that. That is a totally different style production aesthetic. Dr. Dre and Ice Cube, it's almost like a reaction to the polite vibe and music production style of artists like De La Soul and Tribe Called Quest. And if I had to pick between the two of them, maybe I'm just like the Ned Flanders of audio here, but I prefer De La Soul and Tribe Called Quest. Walk on the Wild Side. Thank you. That is the Lou Reed track that is sampled by De La Soul. Those drums are awesome and serious subs. Yeah, totally. How different do you think that the sound of this track was before it was mixed and mastered? And how long do you think that mixing and mastering took to do? Well, these are good questions, but back then, you're talking about mixing on an analog console, you really usually had to finish your mix that day. So still today, I think a lot of the best mixers will mix one song in a day, and then maybe if they need to, we'll come back and do some revisions. Or if they're really efficient, or if the project isn't too crazy, they might mix 2 songs in a day. So that's really common among so many of the best mixers and engineers I talk to. They aim to mix 1 or 2 songs in a day if they're relatively intricate. Because of the realities of mixing on an analog console and you're in a rented studio where a different person might use the studio, or you can't work on another track until you've cleared the console, a lot of the stuff is going to have to be mixed in, one chunk of 2 or 4 hours, or one chunk of up to 8 hours. And maybe you could leave things up and come back to it the next day. But that wasn't as common in that era of production as it is today. A big thing about this is you have to remember they were working to analog tape. When Bob is working on a lot of this stuff, the way that they're sampling is they have samplers, they have digital samplers, and they're using those to sample stuff. And you could potentially bring one of those home with you and do a lot of production on a sampler at home. And I wouldn't be surprised if Q-Tip was doing something like that. But he was also like cutting up tapes, like literally cutting up tape. They were tracking some of this stuff to tape, and he'd be cutting up tape for, different takes to make multiple vocal takes work together. So this is a different era of production where you're committing things to tape and you're trying to get things to sound as finished as possible on the way in. And the mixing, I'm not going to say it's a formality, but it's not this process that will go on for weeks and weeks like it can for a lot of beginning and intermediate mixers today. One question here is, did Bob mix the song called Sucka Ninja? The 808 work on that song is really good. Let's look up the song Sucka Ninja and see if that's one of Bob's or if it's a different sound. This is, right. Ninja is not the act. You were making it so Whitey Colletti over here doesn't say any words that he shouldn't be saying on the stream. But let's look this one up. I'm going to have to type in the double G here and put it into Wikipedia. Man, Google does not like bringing this up here. Here we go. What record is it on? The Best of Tribe Called Quest. What record is it on originally? We're going to have to look it up. It is on, let's find out.
Hey, sucker nigga, whoever you are. Hey, sucker nigga.
It is on Midnight Marauders, 1993. Let's look that one up. I guess saying sucka ninjas is much better than saying sucka N-words, where you really will sound like the Ned Flanders of hip-hop. Is Bob Power on this one? It does say that this album has more sheen to it than the Low End Theory, and this one was mixed on an SSL instead of the Neve they had previously used. Interesting. So let's hear if we hear a difference from that. Bob Power seems to be credited with mixing in general, along with Tribe Called Quest. That's something you'll find on a lot of the Tribe records, except for the first one, where just Q-Tip or Tribe is credited as mixing. The first one, Bob Power shares mixing credits with Tribe Called Quest on their other records. So let's listen to a little bit here and see if we really like the 808 on this as much as the commenter who wrote it.
Hey, sucker nigga, hey, sucker nigga, whoever you are, whoever you are. Hey,
Turn it
sucker
up in my
nigga, whoever
Turn
you
everything
are.
up in the
Hey,
headphones.
sucker
Include my
nigga,
vocals.
whoever you are. Hey,
Yeah, that's
sucker
good.
nigga,
And my vocals a
hey,
little
sucker
bit.
nigga,
Put the
whoever
upper
you
bass line.
are, whoever you are.
I be hating sucker MCs and the sucker niggas, posing
Yeah.
like they hard when we know they damn hard. What you figure? Round wise, I do the figure eight so concisely. Musically, we are the herbs, so sit back and like me.
So some of the sheen that they're talking about doesn't just have to do with the sound of an SSL console, but the way that Bob is EQing this kick drum differently. It might also be a different sample. I mean, the Neve console they were probably on is adding maybe a little bit more harmonic distortion throughout. The EQ controls on there might inspire you to cut some frequencies instead of others. You have these kind of totally sweepable mids on this SSL console that might encourage you and allow you to find certain frequencies that sound kind of muddy and take them out some more. But yeah, this kick sounds like tighter and more impactful in some ways than the record right before this, where things sound a little bit tubbier. So I don't think this is just the console, but a difference in aesthetic choice for how they're approaching the kick. But some of the difference in aesthetic choice might be informed by what the console can do and like what direction it steers you in because of how the saturation profile is a little different, but more importantly, how like tweaking an SSL EQ leads you in different directions than tweaking a Neve EQ. If you're just selecting what frequency to cut and boost at, and just the play in the knob and the visual layout kind of inspires you to EQ differently than you might otherwise. And this is a very differently EQ'd kick than we were hearing on their prior records.
I be hating sucker MCs and the sucker niggas, posing like they hard when we know they damn hard. What you figure? Round wise, I do the figure eight so concisely. Musically, we are the herbs, so sit back and like me. Inhale. My style is kind of fat, reminiscent of a whale. Young girls' desires for the...
But still kind of laid back, set back vocal, really prominent snare, a kind of deep, tubby low end. But in this case, they've streamlined the sound of the low end a little bit more where things kind of tighten up and sound a little bit more modern. All right, going through some more comments here and then we'll close it down. Scotty Hard was the main mixer on the De La Soul album, says Drums. Oh yeah, Scott Hard. Okay. He was definitely credited on there. He's not credited on there alone, so I'd love to find out which particular tracks that Bob might have done mixing work on, or if he was more like a mixing consultant, or whether he did some of the tracks and Scotty did some of the others. If you have a breakdown of that, I'd absolutely love to see it. Sweet. I think that that's a good place to leave it off for today. I was just looking through to see if there were any more comments coming in, hence the long pause. But we listened to a bunch of Bob. I like to listen to a bunch of Bob. And if you like to listen to a bunch of Bob, go check out the playlist. I'll put it in the show notes and the comments, and compare his mixes to the mixes of others in your own time to get a better sense for how he heard things differently than other people in the same era, and how he heard things differently compared to music production in these styles today. And also, if you really want to hear Bob wax poetic, be one of the 1.5 million people who've checked out his masterclass here on the SonicScoop YouTube channel. It's been a few years now since the last time I talked to Bob, but the last time I talked to him, I called him up and I was like, hey, we should do a course together. Like your Mixcon masterclass is still super popular. Why don't we do a course together? And he was open to the idea and he was interested. He's like, yeah, let's talk about that. I want to talk about it in a few months. And I want to get a sense for like how all that would work. And I never followed up on it. And now this is one of my big regrets in life because I always felt like, oh, I can still do that with Bob one of these days later on. And now I can't. And that's a bummer. But At the same time, Bob has spent so many years sharing his knowledge, his wisdom on interviews with places like SonicScoop. I think we've interviewed him 3 times, had him on a masterclass one time. Maybe we've interviewed him 4 times. And he's interviewed in so many other places. He has other masterclasses on other channels. He has a good one with Red Bull. He's done interviews. He's part of just music production history. And he was there for a moment in time that really shaped how a certain genre and a certain era of music sounded. And they honestly don't make records that sound like that anymore today. Although I've got to say, in the past couple of years, I've been hearing a little bit more of the old school Tribe and De La Soul style of mixing with a little bit more reverb in hip hop, where, wow, I'm hearing reverb on a vocal or reverb on a snare drum in a way that I haven't. And I wonder if we're ready for a little bit of a comeback of some of that 90s hip hop aesthetic. And if that happens, the guy they're going to be copying more than anybody is Bob Power. And he is just part of the DNA of music forever. As long as recorded music is still around and there are humans to listen to it, he is part of the story, and the era that he was important in is an era that is not going to be forgotten. So much respect. Rest in peace, Bob Power, wherever you are. Thanks so much for all that you've shared with us. He lived to the age of 73, and he was just a great guy to be around. Talented guy. Thanks so much, Bob. Thank you guys for hanging out for us. With me. I should say, I always say that the podcast is sponsored. I totally forgot to do that because I'm just talking about Bob, who passed away. If you do want to support the podcast and make there be more great free videos like this one, check out our great full-length courses like Mixing Breakthroughs, Mastering Demystify, Compression Breakthroughs, EQ Breakthroughs. They're going to change the way that you work forever. Bob was one of, I think, the guys who I took from the most. Like when I was creating these courses, especially the first one, Mixing Breakthroughs, it really was about interviewing so many of the best mixing engineers in the world and figuring out what made them tick, what they had in common, like what was similar across all their processes. And Bob was absolutely one of the guys who was really influential when I was making that course. I should also shout out that we do have a sponsor on this episode, which is Sound Toys. They were the sponsor on that super famous Bob Power Mixing Masterclass. We actually wouldn't have been able to put on the Bob Power Mixing Masterclass at MixCon if it wasn't for Sound Toys. He was a big fan of their plugins, and the way that we made MixCon free to the public, and we could send in videographers and book the whole venue and pay Bob his fee and edit the video and bring it to you guys, was because of sponsors. And the sponsors on that one was Sound Toys. And I can't remember if they nominated and said, you've got to get Bob Power on. That might have been how it happened, because he was already a user of their stuff. Or I can't remember if we reached out, because we had interviewed him a couple of times by then and said, you guys have to sponsor Bob Power. He loves your stuff. But yeah, Sound Toys is the one that made that Mixing Masterclass possible. And they're the sponsor on this week's podcast too. So check them out over at soundtoys.com. I know they were some of his favorite plugins, and he uses a bunch of them in that masterclass. So I got to put that stuff in there because that is how we make the stuff free to the public. Remember to hit like, subscribe, and if this one was inspiring to you, share it with a friend. Thanks again for hanging out with me. It's been Justin Colletti of SonicScoop. I'll see you next time.